You are listening to the Empowering Working Moms podcast, Real Talk with Dr. Prianca Nayak, a show to help professional moms in survival mode to take hold of their lives and thrive. If you're ready to take powerful action to create your best life, then this is the show for you. I'm your host, Dr. Prianca Nayak, board-certified internal medicine physician and certified life coach. Now let's get to it and dive in. You are listening to the Empowering Working Moms podcast, episode number 17. Hi, thank you so much for tuning in today. Before I dive into today's topic, I want to talk a little bit about how my clients are making breakthroughs left and right. And they're honing in on their own power, which you too have inside of you, to create the exact life that they want. I want you to know that when they came to me, many of these clients, they were in so much pain, they were so mentally exhausted and burned out that the idea of having an enjoyable, peaceful life was so foreign to them, they did not think it was possible. And through coaching, they have learned to empower themselves, love themselves, and grab the exact life that they want. Even if they've dealt with difficult circumstances, such as an abusive work or home environment or an addicted spouse. I want to invite you to please rate and review this show wherever you listen to it, whatever platform, and please share it with anyone that you think might benefit. So the title of this podcast is Empowering Working Moms, Real Talk with Dr. Prianca Nayak. And I bring that up because real talk means that I want to address the deep, dark, dirty issues that people are ashamed or embarrassed to talk about. And I want to highlight them here on this podcast so that if you're in a place where you feel alone, I want you to know that you're not. You are not alone. I promise you. And I know no matter what your life is or where you come from or whatever your circumstances are, we are all human beings, often suffering in the exact same way. So your problems, whatever they might be, there are plenty of other people with them. And even if these are the kinds of things you don't want to talk about with your friends, I'm going to talk about them on this podcast so that not only do you not feel alone, but then you're armed with information and tips to make your life better, more manageable, more peaceful, and truly have courage to take the steps that you might be afraid to take. So today's topic is divorce in South Asian culture. And I talk about South Asian culture because that's the culture I personally am familiar with. But I know that culturally, divorce is taboo in many other areas of the world. I will speak for South Asian culture as I know it. Indian people never get divorced. That felt like a fact I knew growing up. What I also grew up knowing was that a lot of my aunties and uncles were miserable and trapped in unhappy marriages. Openly miserable, unhappy, constantly gossiping about other people, other people's lives, being competitive, trying to one-up each other with a better house or fancier car, or seeing whose kid could get into the best college. And I think the reason that aunties and uncles do this is because it's easier to look outside of themselves and focus on that instead of turning within, looking inward, and seeing what's really going on. And for many of them, leaving their miserable marriages, often arranged marriages, was not an option. So they had to bear through it, grit through it, and just hang in there, whether or not that was miserable for them, whether or not it was setting a bad example for their children. Personal growth and development, mental health, questioning how they were raised, this just wasn't in the mix at all. Mental health as I knew it was my father saying, You must produce. Regardless of whatever effort I put in, that didn't matter. What I knew as normal, most people having arranged marriages, was that they were unhappy and they made it work. Made it work. That's funny, right? What works? What works for each person is different for him or her. But a lot of what worked for them, our parents' generation that is, does not work for us. Because we are not in India. Many of us are born and raised here. The internet exists. Lots of free flowing information. And we strive to do better than our parents did. Mental health, paying attention to mental health is more acceptable as awareness increases, as physician suicide rates are on the rise. Maybe something needs to change. Today, I want to talk about how you may have been raised and how that might impact you a lot more deeply than you think. I'm going to give an example of a South Asian client of mine, an attorney. She was never good enough in her parents' eyes. She was always messing up, according to them. Nothing she did was ever good enough. When she got into a top 14 law school, that was finally good enough. She quote unquote made it. When it came time to get married, her parents wanted her to marry someone from a good family and good on paper. You might be able to relate. She met a handsome, charming Indian doctor. Woo-hoo! Her parents were thrilled. She was finally doing the right thing. Once she married him, things got pretty ugly on the inside. He would have fits of rage and abuse her about the dishes not being done correctly. He was unpredictable. He would punch holes in walls. One time he hit her. She would tell her mother about these issues because she was too ashamed and afraid to talk about them with her friends. She was afraid her friends would tell her to leave her husband, to divorce him. When she would tell her mother about these issues, that she thought that maybe what was going on just wasn't normal, her mother would reply that everyone has problems in their marriages because divorce wasn't really an option. It wasn't until she started coaching with me that she got clear on her vision, on what she wanted. She began to understand that she had been programmed in a very particular way. She realized how dysfunctional her home was growing up. Her mom often abused her father as well, so this behavior was normalized for her. What she realized through coaching was that she didn't want to model this for her children. She wanted to do better. She didn't want them to carry on and do the exact same thing she did if she stayed in her abusive marriage. She would beat herself up about being quote unquote stupid enough to marry such a person when clearly there were red flags early on in her relationship with him. After she started working with me, she learned to be gentle with herself and to give herself compassion. She began to acknowledge that she was programmed from a young age to 1, think abuse and dysfunction were normal. 2, to marry an Indian doctor or someone good on paper with a good resume. 3, to make marriage work no matter what, at all costs, because that's what she observed growing up. As I often talk about, awareness, that is the key, the first step in changing, in breaking free from the cycles and negative patterns to which you are accustomed. My client was able to heal herself, forgive her past self. Like we talked about on episode 15, Healing Mental Exhaustion Through Self-Forgiveness, she learned to practice self-forgiveness. She forgave herself for overlooking the red flags, for doing what she thought was right at the time, for doing the best she could at that time, given who she was, what she had been taught, and what she knew. She wanted to make her parents proud. She stopped being sad, she stopped having regrets, and she stopped calling herself dumb for marrying him in the first place. That in and of itself gave her so much peace. In South Asian families and many other cultures, gaining our parents' approval is huge. From going to a good college, to getting a higher degree, being successful, making money, marrying, quote unquote, the right person. And I say that in air quotes because we are taught that the right person is someone who comes from an allegedly good family and makes a lot of money and has a successful career, perhaps is handsome. All the things that are good on the surface. Being treated properly, being loved and cared for, that's usually not emphasized. Remember, this programming from a young age is deep. I'm bringing up this programming. I'm doing an episode on this because acknowledging that we are programmed in a certain way from a very young age can help us to have compassion for ourselves and to forgive ourselves for perceived poor judgment or decisions. The programming can cloud us from what we actually want. Because often we are taught to live for other people, including our own parents. That in and of itself will never make us happy. What will make us happy is living a life that aligns with our own values. Our values can be partially ours and the good ones that we want to carry on from our parents. Conversely, there are things we do not want to carry forward. So back to my client. Once she realized how dysfunctional her home was growing up, especially regarding abuse, she began to realize how her current home was abusive as well. She got clarity on whether this was acceptable to her because she had to live this life day to day. She had to walk on eggshells every night when she came home, hoping that she wouldn't get abused. She had to do what was acceptable for her, regardless of what other people thought, regardless of what her parents might think. Ultimately, life became unlivable for her as she described it to me, probably because abuse tends to escalate over time. She created boundaries and decided that abuse was no longer acceptable for her. When her perfect on paper husband continued to abuse her, she realized that nothing was going to change. But she had changed. What was acceptable to her at the start of their marriage, today was no longer acceptable. She came to a decision that it was time for her to leave and for her marriage to end. Even though she had been taught that you do not get a divorce ever. Even when her father told her that she was setting a bad example for her children by getting a divorce. Even though she was ashamed for her family to think that she had failed or that her seemingly perfect life was far from perfect. The jig was up, but she was okay with that because she learned to do what was right for her, what was livable for her, separate from her South Asian upbringing. She was paving her own way. Coaching helped her to get out of confusion and into clarity, to live a life that aligned with her values, not her parents, not her aunties and uncles, to make clean decisions without spinning in confusion about what others would do and what others would think. She found herself courageous to take the next steps. She felt at peace and free. She also learned that no one else really cared about her life as much as she did. No one understood what it was like to be in her shoes day to day. She had to decide what worked for her and ultimately realize that though divorce was the correct thing for her, that she needed to get out of the abusive marriage, she needed to set a better example for her children. She knew this, but she also knew that divorce would never be okay for her because she was raised to never get one, no matter how bad things were in the marriage, no matter how detrimental it might be to her mental health. When she filed, she told me she was so unhappy. She struggled with how doing the right thing hurt her, how it hurt. She felt pain, and how this was so counterintuitive. And I bring this up because often it is not easy to do the right thing. And it hurts sometimes, even when you're doing the right thing. And what plays into this is our programming from a young age. This programming often dictates our decisions as adults. But it doesn't dictate it in the sense that we are powerless, right? We allow this programming to dictate how we behave. And if we are able to acknowledge how we were programmed, decide what part of the programming we want to subscribe to, and what perhaps does not work for us, we can empower ourselves to make an active decision as to how we want to live our lives. If you, like my client, know in your gut that your marriage, for example, is dysfunctional, that things are not going to change, that you're holding on to hope because the idea of divorce seems unthinkable. And maybe in the back of your mind, the right thing is to leave. But you can't bring yourself to make a move. You feel stuck and trapped. You feel like you don't have the courage. Remember, give yourself grace, remove your self-judgment, follow your instinct, know that you may not enjoy every right decision. Also know that you can always change your mind. You can do hard things with a lot of self-love. For understanding how to practice self-love, refer to episode 11, Practicing Self-Love for Inner Peace, and episode 12, Self-Love in Divorce, You Are Not Alone. Please be patient with yourself when making big, scary, daunting decisions. Trust yourself that you will find your way. We have a chance to do things better than the previous generations, to break cycles of generational trauma, and to give ourselves and our children a better life. If you are a professional mom in survival mode and want to move through mental exhaustion, get out of a toxic relationship or job, feel courage, confidence, and find peace through one-on-one coaching with me, book a time for a free 30-minute consultation call to see what is possible. www.priancanayakmdcoaching.as.me, link in the show notes, and I will talk to you next week. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Empowering Working Moms podcast, Real Talk with Dr. Prianca Nayak. If you are ready to get unstuck and out of survival mode to live your best life, I want to invite you to book a free 30-minute consultation call with me. To get started, visit priancanayakmdcoaching.as.me. Link in the show notes.